Continuing on the nature theme, our next how-to is how to design with nature. Design for Planet and regenerative design are all about designing so that nature flourishes. And who else has always been doing that but landscape designers? Jeremy Rye is a landscape designer and land walker. He believes that landscape is fundamental to our lives and to how we see and understand our being. He sees his role as a designer and a creative is to interpret and demonstrate the essence of the landscape itself and our place in it and ourselves as well. Jeremy, please share some of your practices with us.
Hello, good afternoon. Delight to be joining you here today at the Design Council's conference. It's really wonderful. Yes, I mean, it's a fabulous topic to put into for all designers to really be looking at how we actually need to design with nature. As a landscape architect, I spend my life asking this very question to myself and trying to discover what it is that nature needs and then how I can meet that need within what I'm doing. Fundamentally, what I've come to understand is that we need to question ourselves about the boundaries that we put in place through design for nature to flourish. It's the most important part of what nature needs, is it needs to be able to complete its cycles. Now, we know that nature has an annual cycle, but in that annual cycle, everything is so intertwined that we need to understand as designers exactly where that cycle will take us and how we can help it, be informed by it, because it's not only nature that works in this cycle. What I've begun to understand more and more, and what I practice with, is that we ourselves are part of that cycle, and that we are so closely aligned with nature that by looking at design that doesn't allow nature to flourish, then we're restricting ourselves in terms of how we flourish in aligned with nature. What we feel on a monthly basis, we can see being mirrored in nature in itself. So therefore, if we're putting up boundaries to how we live and where we live and how we live with nature, we're also putting up boundaries between ourselves and understanding what we're going through. So fundamentally, when I'm looking at how I design a landscape or a garden, I'm looking at how I can help support what nature goes through, because I believe that in doing that, I'm also supporting the people that will go through all of that as well. My actual work covers probably about 4 areas of this. I not only want to include all of this within the designs that I do for landscapes, but what I also do is I take people out into the landscape, into nature, to help them feel how those cycles of nature exist within their own lives. Because by helping people to feel that, to really understand how closely aligned we are, then especially with designers, it brings them in another layer of understanding the importance of nature, but also their role, regardless of what they're designing, in how nature responds to us. Now, clearly, with what I do, nature's response is very visible, whether it survives, whether it flourishes. But in everything we do, there will be a response from nature. And it's important we really understand how we measure that response, how we feel that response, and the reaction that people get to it. I'm also about really needing to understand in depth about what those cycles of nature actually are and how they're all intertwined, because it makes a big difference in designing gardens or landscapes if I'm understanding how what I do will impact on all the different levels of cycles. and how any boundaries I might create. Now, those boundaries don't necessarily need to be physical, like fences or walls. What I'm talking about is actually a boundary to nature completing its cycle and its role. For example, we have in the silver birch tree, a tree that has a role in nature of the foundation. It knows that its role is to prepare the soil for what's to come in the future. It does everything it does about breaking down the soil, everything it does about fertilizing the soil, everything it does about introducing nutrients, but also introducing other animals and living beings that surround it and feed off of it, is about enhancing that piece of land for what is to come next. It does that, it prepares it, it allows and nurtures those seedlings of other trees to come, and then slowly they will overtake it and it will move on. We often come in and want to hold a landscape in a certain place because we've seen this beautiful silver birch woodland and we want to hold it. So we maintain it in a way that means the silver birch remains, when in fact we should be allowing that to evolve and change, but knowing that the silver birch will move on to another piece of land and create it in there. And I see my role very much about having to understand all those cycles and support all those cycles, not to try and hold a piece of land in one place, but to understand how and where that piece of land might go. There was a particularly interesting gentleman called the Reverend William Wilkes, fascinating man, in the 20th century. 1908, he bought this piece of land, a strip of woodland, and a piece of heathland. And at that sort of time, there was a movement towards the natural, but it was very much to do with natural planting styles. So they were still creating paths and borders, terraces, fountains. But he, as a naturalist, and I think more of a naturalist than he actually was a reverend, he wanted to work with nature. And so he didn't build paths, he didn't put borders in. What he did was to embellish what was already there with plants he felt would enhance the cycles of nature as he understood them at the time. He was experimenting, and some of the things that he introduced, he ended up regretting, as we all do. But he had the understanding that we needed to start to work with nature, a phrase that I use, of taking nature's hand and being guided by nature and using nature to create something that increases the biodiversity, that enlivens everything around it. My role with this particular project was to come in after years of neglect and actually begin to re-find the ethos that he had created, and to help rebalance some of the mistakes that he'd created where he'd introduced plants that weren't appropriate. But he also wanted to keep that landscape evolving. And he recognized that man had a role to play in that. We lost most of that idea, despite what he wrote about, didn't continue. And through most of the 20th century, we have continued in our way of gardening, which, whilst we may embrace certain aspects of nature, say planting for birds, bees, butterflies, all very important, what we're finding is that we are focusing on one particular part of the cycle rather than trying to embrace all of the cycles of nature. Until we started to come up with this idea of the wild, or I like to sort of see it as a naturalizing of our landscape. particularly one of the forerunners is a project called Nep Castle, not one of mine, but they are looking at removing boundaries both physically, but also removing boundaries for things that are part of nature's cycle, but no longer exist. And they see their role, and this is what I think is the most important, as helping to close that gap, to understand where those gaps exist, and to take part. So their idea of maintenance is not to maintain as we might a garden, but to maintain in terms of closing the gaps for a cycle that exists but doesn't have the relevant people or doesn't have the relevant animals still there that will help enhance the biodiversity at all levels, not only what's going in the soil, what's on the soil, what works above the ground as well. They've made a very important step into beginning to piece together how we work with nature in all of that way. And it's really important that I, in my role, start to really think about, when I'm designing, what boundaries am I putting in place that actually put a boundary around nature completing a cycle? And how can I change that? I've just started a really exciting project up in Scotland with a series of community gardens. And the proposal there is to really unpick what that landscape needs by understanding its soil, understanding the conditions that now exist around it, because it is in a built-up area, but it's a series of smaller gardens, and looking at what's going on around it, what nature might need as a place to fulfill certain functions on its way and around working within a city. So we could look at the water, for example. What water exists? How are we going to bring water into this site? What water already exists? In the William Wilkes Garden, for example, it was discovered as part of our project that certain buildings around, particularly a school that had been developed on green fields in the sort of 1920s, 1930s, had changed the water table. And so what had been created was a much more bog garden that hadn't actually been there when the Reverend Wilkes had been gardening. So our role was actually to understand the pattern of that water and to enhance it, because one of the things that that area had been known for and had been reduced was sphagnum moss. And we discovered in this area 3 or 4 varieties of sphagnum moss that meant that this became a really important site. And part of our maintenance was to work that particular part of the garden to encourage more varieties of sphagnum moss to be able to come in. And that's exactly what we're looking at, what we're analysing in this community garden in Scotland, to try and understand what's there already, to try and understand the land's highest potential for that area and how we can help and enhance that and bring more of nature into this place, into this city, in a way that means that the people benefit, but the city also benefits from this. So I think that we really need to be looking at designing with nature about how we remove the boundaries that we put in place to nature completing its cycle. So looking at, what am I doing that creates a boundary? How can I design the removal of that boundary? How can I then enhance the cycles of nature that exist? But how can I fulfill a role in helping nature to complete its cycles rather than having to cope and find a way around what we're imposing on it? Or how what I design be used as part of that as well? The other side is to really begin to engage with the cycles of nature that exist within us and understand that how we feel at any time of the year is emulated within nature itself, and taking people out, designing ourselves around those cycles of nature, our well-being aligning with those cycles of nature, feels the most important way that we can then begin to bring our awareness to everything we do and everything we design. I've seen people, when I've taken them out on these walks and put a framework around their thinking that help them understand what this month is gifting us, begin to realize that what they're seeing and what they're feeling in and around themselves is part of a cycle in nature, and that the best time to deal with it, or the best time to explore, is the time that nature is showing us of what's going on around it. Everything that we need to know and understand is in nature. By taking nature's hand, by being guided by what nature needs, and using our landscapes and our gardens. I see this as, as keeping our fences, but removing the boundaries and allowing ourselves all to flourish by working hand in hand or taking nature's hand. I've talked for about 15 minutes. What I really want to do is to get some questions and start to try and engage with all of you about your experiences working with nature, or how this idea of designing without boundaries might work in what you do. And I'll pass back to Alicia, who's going to facilitate this next part of my talk.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. That was absolutely beautiful to listen to.
Thank you.
So a few questions that we already have. So have you any thoughts on how buildings should better interact with landscape so we can benefit more from nature?
Oh, how buildings will interact with landscape.
Yes.
What examples have I? I think there needs to be a distinct connection to what's going on outside in nature. The way that buildings visually interlink with nature is a really important threshold, but also how the building itself can engage with nature. We had a project I was working on with an architect where that was our very question. If this building exists in this site and all inhabitants are balanced, what would that need to be? How would it sit on the ground? What other parts of that building would we need to be incorporating that would help and bring another dimension into this landscape that wasn't existing at the moment? What role could it play within that nature? And I know you had a talk earlier today about all the materials as well, about how materials have an impact on all of that. So I'm going to leave that one to the previous speaker. But for me, it's about the role that the buildings can actually play and how we can enhance and broaden that role.
Another question is from Francis. I'd be interested to know, what are your views on rewilding?
I think it's a really important step in the right direction for how we're viewing landscape. I think it's what it's doing is making us question how we need, the changes we need to make. But I don't think it is the answer to absolutely all of landscape. I think we've got really good work being done on pastoral farming as well. So it is one of the many areas of how we need to look at how we interact with nature. And there are some areas that are much better presented for dealing with areas of rewilding than maybe others. I talk to a lot of people who are either landowners or farmers, and we still need to grow food. We still need to work with nature to grow things. So it is not an answer that I would suggest for the whole of the countryside, but it is one really important part where appropriate to start to look at how we can engage with nature in that way, this idea of wilding, as well as this idea of pastoral agriculture as well.
Great, thank you. Kelvin asks, I'm planning to regenerate depleted farmland around 30 hectares in Alentejo, Portugal. Please forgive me for my my pronunciations. The Alentejo suffers from heavy deforestation and desertification. Where should I start?
Can you repeat where this is, please?
It's in Alentejo, Portugal.
Right, okay. Not a landscape that I know huge amounts, but in terms of principles, if we are looking at how we begin to work with nature and we begin to naturalize rather than necessarily looking at completely rewilding, we need to look at where areas around us are actually already doing this naturally, to start to see what is growing and what actually needs to be brought onto site. It's a really difficult and very fragile process of taking a site that has had either over farming or it's been used for a different function, contamination, and actually begin to unpick that. And part of that unpicking, really, we need to understand what has gone on that specific site before. We need to know what we're dealing with within the soils. And we need to look at how the natural processes that exist outside will help break down what we find on that site. I don't know, obviously know this particular site to know the exact nature of what you need to bring in. But when I'm working on this, what I'm inspired by is what is going on around and looking at what I can then start to be introducing. But fundamentally, I want to understand the site I'm working with. Just before we came on air, Alicia and I were talking about water. And if we look at that, it's about how water is moving through the site, what access to water, how water can be made to play a role within this actual site. Now, I know in certain parts, in certain countries, water is a real scarcity, but it is understanding the systems that are in place surrounding it that help you understand a system that you can then start to bring in.
Maybe there's an opportunity for future collaboration.
Of course.
I have another question from Joe.
Yeah.
Do you believe that there is a benefit to reflecting nature in our design or brand work? Is that part of raising awareness?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Do you believe there is a benefit to reflecting nature in our design or brand work? Is that part of raising awareness?
Yeah, I think it's really important to reflect nature in all our design work. And what I was talking about in terms of the removing boundaries, I mean, whilst the philosophy or the practicality for how I would do that exists within landscape architecture to look at engaging with nature in cycles, what we know is that these boundaries, particularly in my field, end up costing the earth. And I think that as a question is how does what I do cost the earth? And I know that used to be seen as a positive statement that something cost the earth. It was considered to be, the money side of it all. But now when we really think about it, and we think about the choices that we all make in day-to-day processes, is about how does what I design cost the earth? And that often is because we're putting up boundaries. And then my thinking is, well, then how can I remove those boundaries? How can I move continually further forward to a place where we're not costing the earth? So I think it really is important that we reflect nature in all that we do.
Definitely. So I only have time for probably 2 more questions. So this one is from Bass. I'm fascinated by how you talk about cycles and gaps in them we need to fill. Do you use any type of drawing or mapping to visualize these cycles?
I don't, I have to admit. What I'm doing is a lot of analyzing of what has been there before and what is going on before. And it's about me inherently learning and working with the cycles that I know already, and bringing the right people in, bringing the right team together to really understand how these cycles exist. So some of those people will be using mapping, particularly we keep referring to water, the hydrology of a site, then we are absolutely bringing those in. But I, in my own design role, will be bringing in other people who have those skill sets or those understandings. The only maps that I really use, which I'm completely obsessed about, are the OS plans, the history, because primarily a lot of the work I do is within historical landscapes, poring over how we've used landscape, how this has evolved to where we are today, is an important part of how I begin to unpick what is there now. But we do use other people consistently who will bring in their expertise in topography, hydrology, all that sort of stuff.
And the last question is from Laura. Do you work in partnership with a botanic or ecologist to understand the cycles of nature?
Yes. Different ones, depending on what we're working with and what landscape we're working with and their particular skill sets. And it doesn't just evolve around ecologists. We work with biologists as well, herbalists. I recently did a project where we were very much focused on the symbolism behind herbs. And so we needed to find somebody, a herbalist, who really understood not only their properties, but their symbolism, because often plants, trees have a resonance or a symbolism that we've worked with for ancient times. So yes, absolutely. I do not, and I don't think any landscape architect can profess to know everything about what we're dealing with. And so it's really important to find those key people. It was great fun working with the lady who was a herbologist, the herbalist, because she had these stories and she had this wisdom that came from just studying that particular subject, which was just fascinating. And the combinations when we were planting, obviously we do it for seasons, but she was also doing it for what works well together in terms of symbols, in terms of medicinal properties. And I'd never designed a garden whereby different things sitting next to each other were helping and supporting.
That's gorgeous. Well, thank you so much, Jeremy, for sharing more about your work. Just to also mention that we've got a wonderful how-to next, continuing Jory Tunstall's call for anti-oppressive co-design from yesterday, or for a zoomed out conversation about this, head over to the main stage for designers working with AI, which include Lex Fafega and also Rob Maslin. Thank you.